Hello and welcome everybody to the Science Business webinar on the US, politics of science, and the future of transatlantic cooperation. I'm David Matthews, Science Business's international editor, covering the US's relations with the rest of the world. And the reason, pretty obviously, that we've organized this webinar is the head-spinning number of changes the new Trump administration has made to US science during the president's first 100 days. So these have massive implications for the US, but also for the transatlantic research relationship too. So this webinar is going to be split into two parts. The first will be a kind of briefing on what on earth has been happening in the US since Trump was inaugurated and what the implications for relations with Europe might be. So it's my day job to understand all of this, but like everyone else, I felt completely overwhelmed by the number and scale of changes. So we'll start by trying to get our heads around exactly what has happened. Then in the second half of the webinar, we're going to ask, how is Europe responding to these dramatic changes and cuts in the US science system? And also ask, how do American scientists want Europe to respond? So we won't have massively long, we just have an hour to get over a huge amount of material, but we should have time for a couple of audience questions. If you are curious, please ask them in YouTube and I will put them to the panelists. So we'll kick off with the briefing part of this webinar. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cole Donovan, who will be talking us through what exactly has happened in the first 100 days of the new Trump administration. So Cole has more than a decade of experience on research policy with a focus on international collaboration, for example, at the US Office of Science and Technology Policy, the US State Department, and the Office of Space Commerce, and several other organizations. So he's really, really well placed to walk us through this. He's just joined the Federation of American Scientists as an associate director. So we'll kick things off. Cole, when we spoke about this before, you kind of grouped what has happened in the US so far under four sort of broad headings, right? As a way to kind of understand the sort of seemingly dozens of headlines and changes that have happened so far. So if you could sort of talk us through how you understand what the Trump administration has done so far.
Well, thank you, David. And it is good to be joining you guys to talk about something, a topic where I've spent most of my career, which is working on transatlantic research and development cooperation, as well as space cooperation. I really, to kind of get at the heart of your question, one of the real difficulties addressing this is the fact that things are moving so quickly at this point that any grouping you put together has a probability of changing either in a day or week or month or however long. But in general, I think that the four categories that we spoke about earlier stand up relatively well. The first that we talked about are the executive orders and memoranda concerning programs related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this is the pausing and halting of grants and other funding mechanisms, as well as work at agencies that supports this. It includes the dismissal of scientists. It includes, basically curbing the power of offices of civil rights and other institutions throughout the government. The second category that we spoke about was basically this the work that is related to universities, right? And so you have large institutions that are largely perceived to be of a predominant political leaning in the United States and in universities. And so what has happened is that the administration has gone out to those universities and made certain demands that go from everything about changing the composition of their academic programs to putting certain programs in government receivership, and then also putting things like hiring and admissions under the microscope through regular audits and the like. The third are what I would call inconvenient institutions, which kind of harkens back to the 2020 COVID era. If you don't test, you won't find any cases type thinking, where there's a lot of data collection that is done by the federal government, and there are a lot of work uh, that's done by science agencies that creates information or facts that are viewed as disruptive to business, to other things. And so there's been a curtailment of those types of activities. And then the fourth area, which is also changing rapidly, has to do with the visa status of international scholars who are in the United States, many of whom have seen their visas either rescinded due to political activities on campuses, primarily related to the conflict in Gaza, and then also looking at folks who have been turned around at the border or placed in certain situations where ordinarily minor things like filling out the wrong form for a border crossing might result in someone being turned back rather than a correction being made at the border. So you have a lot of stuff going on. Things are very rapidly changing here. Again, I'm trying to resist talking about any individual research agency for that reason, because as soon as somebody watches this, something is likely changed. So thank you.
Great. Indeed, great. Thank you, Cole. That's a really great overview. And yes, indeed, since multiple new things have happened since we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. So let's just go through those areas in a bit more detail. And your first one is this sort of I guess clamp down on anything to do with DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this isn't just sort of training programs or hiring schemes, right? This is the ending of grants, particularly the NIH, which look at any kind of I guess it's sexual minorities, transgender people, ethnic minorities, and their for example, health disparities, right? And if you go through the list of NIH cancelled grants, we did this a few weeks ago. Huge numbers of anything to do with sort of transgender health has been cancelled, but also things about differences between men and women in the population. A few things on teens and social media and anxiety, that kind of thing. It seems like there is a general push against studying these anything that has as its premise that there will be sort of social inequities in health and maybe even broader, right? And I guess for European health scientists, epidemiologists, social scientists, that push is going to could make cooperation somewhat more difficult, because this is one of the key areas that you might study as a health scientist or as an epidemiologist, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that what's also interesting is that the director of NIH has spent a considerable amount of his own career working on economic and social disparities in health, right? So this does reflect a change in thinking or viewpoint for many or most of the people who are involved in this. Yeah, and yes, for Europe, you have a lot of requirements even within grants that relate to addressing gender or social disparities. For instance, there's the widening program under Horizon Europe. There's also, requirements for gender balance on teams and the like. And so that putting uh, those types of things under the microscope in the United States escalates the likelihood that you'll have some sort of legal or administrative conflict between the requirements associated with an NIH grant, for instance, or those in European countries.
Right. I guess it's worth saying that the NIH is not the only funder of this kind of work in the US. Universities have their own funding streams, and maybe private streams, charitable foundations. So it's not as though all this work on sort of social disparities, particularly in health, grinds to a halt, but it is severely restricted under the NIH and maybe more so. Just sort of to tack on to the end of that, we've mentioned these organizations, the NIH in particular. I mean, the White House has recently released its sort of budget, what it would like to see happen for the budgets of these agencies, and they're looking at potentially huge cuts. So more than 50% for the NSF, NIH that's looking at around 40%. I think NASA's should be down about half. These would be huge cuts, but of course they have to be approved by Congress, which might have other ideas. It did in the first Trump presidency. But we don't know. I mean, this is a Republican Party that seems to be less willing to contradict Trump as it was in the first term.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of reporting in the US about the difficulty associated with budget negotiations just in general. And so what I would mention is that what's different now between 2017, which is when I served in the first Trump administration as a civil servant, is that there appears to be a greater desire to use things like impoundment or rescissions to try to reduce the expenditure of these agencies. So just as was briefed to European science diplomats in 2017 by someone who became my boss later, there's always the likelihood that an organization like OMB could restrain an agency's spending up until the last minute, which would make it very difficult to spend large sums of money.
Yeah.
So that's
the OMB's Office of Budget
yeah.
Management. This is right. This is one of the sort of organizations that's pushing through widespread in the US, but not just in science.
Yeah, and they have to do with budget across the government as well as regulatory and other activities. You have OIRA, for instance, which gets to decide whether or not agency regulations meet the legal requirements of things like the Paperwork Reduction Act, for instance. So they have an enormous amount of power and control with respect to the spending and activities of government agencies.
So we're saying that this, Congress will have its say over the budgets of these agencies, right? But there are kind of powers that can be used and are being used this time round that were maybe not deployed under the first Trump administration.
Certainly not to this degree.
Yeah, okay. Let's drill into the second one. The second of your categories, this sort of broad threat to the funding of research universities. We've seen some of the biggest, the more targeted, obviously Harvard. I think it's probably worth just spelling out what the Trump administration, of one of its many demands of Harvard, it wanted to do. It wanted, as I understand it, effectively get Harvard to sort of mass appoint what would effectively have been pro-Trump faculty and students in order to restore, in what the administration says, viewpoint diversity, right? This would have been pretty enormous as a kind of government intervention in try anything like this in the first term, as I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, anytime that you start dealing with hiring and admissions at a university, you're talking about changing the ideological composition of the institution, and which has a direct impact on academic freedom, right? There are certainly parts of the U.S. education system that favor certain forms of teaching in one direction or another. I myself went to a graduate school that was quite different than what you might see at Harvard. And so when you start thinking about this and the role of the federal government in higher education, which has historically been providing, grants to low-income students, grants for research and development, that sort of thing, you are seeing much more of an attempt to shape the ideological predispositions of these universities and academic institutions. Speaking of Harvard, there was the letter that was sent last night, basically threatening to cut off all federal funding and future federal funding to Harvard University. So this is a story that is very much not done yet. And it's something that we are likely to see more about in the near future.
Yeah. And I suppose the implication for Europe is that the US research universities, they now have a great deal of uncertainty over their budgets, right? Because they've hit back legally against, or at least Harvard has hit back legally against the Trump administration's threat to freeze federal funding. But it's possible, I mean, we don't know yet, but it's possible that they could be more reluctant to strike up international partnerships, for example, research partnerships, which are going to be costly, of both in terms of money, but also, management time and concentration. So again, we're speculating about the future here, but this could be a potential casualty of these actions against research universities in the US.
Yeah, and I think that what's particularly interesting about this is that there's general acknowledgement in the administration and elsewhere that we are in a technology competition with certain major players, and so when you restrain the ability of some of your highest performing institutions to engage in research and development that's supported by the federal government, you're creating a natural restraint on the ability of those institutions to productively engage in that competition. This would be like if the PRC decided to limit grants at Tsinghua University if they didn't like the ideological composition of that faculty.
Right, right. Now, there's this other category you looked at, which is sort of broadly infrastructure and data, right? Research data, research infrastructure. Just to pick up on one of the things we've talked about in the past. I mean, one of the first notable things the Trump administration did was to limit overhead spending at NIH grants. This is sort of the amount you can spend on, the sort of bills to keep universities running, infrastructure, that kind of thing. It cut that down quite significantly, which is, effectively a cut in funding to universities that receive these kind of grants. But it has also done this at other departments and agencies as well, including the Department of Energy, which I think has quite a few implications potentially internationally as well, if you can just touch on those.
Yeah, so one of the major things that have been cut at agencies or that the government has attempted to cut are what we call indirect costs, which basically are funds that are used for anything that's not related to the research itself, right? It's much more complicated to talk about than that, but just for the sake of the audience, a lot of this has to do with keeping the lights on, running administrative programs like research security programs that the government is asking of universities, and also paying for the maintenance and upkeep of equipment. And for an agency like the Department of Energy, which funds facilities and particularly advanced technology facilities at universities, those indirects can be quite high. There is an overall federally negotiated indirect cost rate that agencies have to compensate, which kind of shares the burden across the enterprise. But part of what you see from the philanthropic community and from others has been that the relationship has been that the federal government has been willing to step in and pay for more of these costs, which then helps the philanthropic community and businesses pay a lower indirect cost. And so by cutting the costs for what the administration claims is to make it more fair between these, you're likely going to see more pressure on philanthropies and on private sector organizations to maintain and keep these capabilities if they provide valuable services for them, which is something that they absolutely do.
Okay. And does the DOE, I mean, are there, could this hit funding streams to kind of big international research infrastructures that US pays into potentially, or do we not know that yet?
Yes, absolutely. So for
Okay.
instance, at NSF, most of the large facilities are actually managed by grants to a university or other institution. And so, for instance, the University of Madison, Wisconsin has been involved in a lot of activities at the South Pole. And so, there obviously the operating costs can be quite high to manage a research station. And they have
Right.
zeroed out the budget for large facilities at NSF. So that all the work there is potentially in trouble.
Okay. So big global research infrastructures, I mean, as I say, we don't know yet, but we might see down the road the US partner on those suddenly saying, because of these overhead cost changes, we may struggle to up and uphold our part of the budget, for example.
That's right. Or institutions may simply not apply for funding, which means
Right.
fewer projects moving forward.
Nice. Okay. And data as well. I mean, we've seen risks to uh, uh, things like sort of health census data in the US has been has been threatened, but this does also have international implications, right? On, for example, monitoring seas, that kind of thing, right? Or ocean climate. This could, if you could give us a few details on what the risks are there.
So obviously there's a lot of concern about the safety of environmental data sets and the like. But just speaking to my own experience, there was a leaked passback a few weeks ago that suggested that my old office and the Office of Space Commerce would no longer be funding space traffic management activities. And one of the things that they would produce are something called conjunction data messages, which are used to help prevent spacecraft from running into each other at Mach 25 in low Earth orbit, which could create a mess that is that recalls the movie Gravity, even though the physics in that movie are not particularly good. Um, so, it's not just things like climate programs and the like, but it's also safety programs and other activities that the government funds, that the government believes should probably be managed by or this government believes that it should probably be managed by the private sector or just not at all.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that's the sort of third block of stuff that's happening, if we can call it that. Number four is this, I guess, immigration tightening, should we say?
You're breaking up a little bit, David. I'm sorry.
Deportation of quite a few students, I think in the hundreds, possibly. Yeah. Okay. There's been this sort of immigration clampdown on students who have participated in I mean, it's largely seems to be targeted against students who have participated in pro-Palestine protests, but there's also quite a few, international students who just seem to have committed maybe very minor infractions that in the past would not have seen them lose their student visas, but they now do seem to have lost those under this new administration. We've also seen there was a story, I'm sure everyone recalls this, a few weeks ago, on a CNRS researcher who was supposedly turned away at the border on the way to an academic conference for having sort of critical messages in their social media about the Trump administration science policies. The US denied this was why it was. But there is this risk of a kind of cooling, a kind of reluctance of European PhD students, postdocs, and senior researchers to study in or travel to the US, and that this could be another sort of person-to-person way that that cooperation is impacted.
Yeah, and I mean I think that what you said is exactly right, and I should say that the administration has suggested that it's going to back off from some of the visa related um, actions that they've been taking lately, though there has also been suggestion from other parts of the administration that they might just be looking for a different way to do it. So it's hard to really characterize where this is right now. What I would say is that we saw this escalate during the first Trump term as well. So this is now a second shock to the system that we've seen.
Mhm.
So it's possible that this will have a much more damaging and long-term effect
Yeah.
on the U.S. academic enterprise and the willingness of people to come and study in the United States, particularly for PhD programs that might last more than 4 years.
Okay. And there were just two last week, other major changes that impact transatlantic cooperation. Um, we got news last week of a policy change by the NIH that we're still kind of digesting exactly what this means, but it appears they are pausing new money to be allowed new money to go to foreign sub-awardees, right? So they will award money to a US university who can then pay, say, European research organizations to do part of the project for them, right? And they are pausing uh, the award of these sub-awards. I mean, you can still, I think, as a European organization, directly get money from the NIH, but this could potentially snarl up quite a few projects where American universities have taken on European partners for NIH projects.
Yeah, and this is just one of the like ways that people grease the wheels when it comes to international cooperation in general. Subawards in the United States are not monitored as closely as they are in under like Horizon Europe. Um, but uh, but in general, we have chosen that policy in the past in order to make it as easy as possible for us to maintain international collaborative networks. And so one example might be a university that is doing Ebola research in the United States would provide funding to an institution or organization in West Africa or Central Africa to study something like Ebola, right?
Right.
And these are necessary resources in order for that research to happen, right? Um,
Mhm.
the reason that they are citing for this change has to do with security concerns, some of which we saw manifest during COVID with the funding of organizations like the Eco Health Alliance, which allegedly, engaged in gain of function, supported gain of function
Yeah.
research.
This was a sort of award
China.
to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right, which attracted a lot of controversy and then has become a sort of lightning rod of criticism for US Republicans and some others, certainly.
Yeah, that's right. And I think rather than, just speaking to my previous role doing research security, rather than recognizing that this particular research is dangerous and might need to be controlled more tightly, it appears that part of the response, which, admittedly, they did release an executive order, I think yesterday or the day before, on dual use research of concern, which, gain of function research would fall under.
Mhm.
But they have also, you know, they've chosen to go much broader, I think, here
Yeah.
and go after, all international sub awards.
Okay. And just finally, before we move on to the next session of the webinar, there's also this change or potential change that we reported on last week, which under a State Department reorganization, there are plans to scrap within the State Department this body called the Organization for Office of Science and Technology Cooperation, which kind of updates and manages, I mean, it's literally hundreds of agreements and sub-agreements with other countries. There's
Yeah.
thousands.
So
Okay, you were there. I
yeah,
mean, and the plan is scrap this office, and we just don't know if it was scrapped, how those agreements with other countries would be maintained, and what that would mean for US cooperation with other countries.
Yeah, so this is actually very personal to me because that's the office where I started my career. The issue there is that basically whenever you have a large project or a major data transfer agreement, for instance, an agreement between the United States and the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, the World Meteorological Organization, that sort of thing, CERN. All of those agreements have to undergo a consultation with the Secretary of State. And it's important that we be consistent in the way that we manage that review. Otherwise, you'll have potentially different parts of the department negotiating different deals that might be of varying quality and might, affect the interests of the United States differently. So, basically removing that process and that office without a really solid plan in place could mean that the consultations between the State Department and the science agencies, of which there are hundreds every year, including just reviewing simple statements to see whether they're binding or not. That type of assessment, when you consider, every single multilateral meeting, there's usually a statement that comes out at the end of it. If the U.S. government isn't able to join those because we're not able to figure out the review process, that could be significantly disruptive to international data flows, to participation in international projects and activities, and many other things. So this is one of those like tiny little cards at the bottom of the house of cards that if you remove it, it could potentially have a much broader impact on transatlantic cooperation in general.
I think it's fair to say that it's not yet being scrapped, but this is people within the State Department have been told that it will be, or it's set to be, although it's not absolutely set in stone yet. But this is certainly another potential risk. Okay, we've reached the halfway point already. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, but hopefully this has allowed viewers to make a bit more sense of what has been going on. Thank you so much for that incredibly detailed and comprehensive overview of what has been happening. We'll now move on to ask sort of how Europe is responding and how indeed should it respond. So I can introduce our other two guests this afternoon. So first of all, I have Denis Bertin, who is running the Safe Space for Science program at Aix-Marseille University, which you've probably heard about. It's probably the most prominent attempt to attract US researchers to Europe so far. So then he can give us some details on who has applied so far and why. And then after that, we'll speak to Erica Goldman, who is Director of Science Policy at the Federation of American Scientists. And she's going to give us what I think is a bit of a neglected view in the debate so far of how Europe should respond, which is, what do American scientists think Europe should do? Because they have a view too, and so we're going to ask Erica for her views on that. So first of all, I'll kick off with Denis. So Denis, this program you're giving, I think it's 15 US-based scientists positions in France. So the general idea is so they can continue research which has been which is under pressure or has been shuttered in the US. So can you run us through some of the headline statistics so far, sort of how many people have applied, what kind of scientists have applied, what kinds of disciplines? Just give us a sense of the demand, because this is sort of the real first litmus test of whether there may actually be a sort of brain drain or reverse brain drain back from the US to Europe as a result of Trump's policies. So if you could give us a few details so far, that would be great.
Yeah. So good afternoon. So maybe first, before saying about statistics and about the program Safe Place for Science, we had some alerts about what we discussed before with Cole Donovan, about a decrease of fundings and many things. So by international colleagues, not mainly in US first, That's why we, during the first trimester in 25, we discussed about the possibility of how to promote and to continue international collaborations, not only in US, but the new policy from the Trump government. We go further to open the program, so Safe Place for Science. So we open it at the beginning of March, close to the 5th or 6th of March, 25. And at the end of March, for the first step, we had close to 300 applications. This is the first key point.
For 15 places.
For 15 up to 20, because
Okay.
The budget allowed for the first step of the program is around 15 million euro. And it's quite classical to tenure track systems, so it's a worldwide system, very well known, whatever the country, in US, in Germany, in UK, not so famous in France, but it's a tenure track position. That means 3 years plus 2 systems. So yeah, you're right. So following, it's close to 1 million euro for one applicant.
Right.
So you're right. It's around 15 up to 20. It depends. I will describe more just after. So we closed following the high number of applications, so close to 300 for the first month of opening the call, of the open call. Sorry. So we close at the end of March. And about disciplines or topics, you asked me, is mainly in 3 categories. One is exact science. We can't put in this global topics about climate change, about environmental, from physics, from geography, from also some social and human science dedicated to topic like climate. We have also astrophysics. We called about the NASA. We have strong partnership, international one, with US colleagues in exoplanets, with telescopes, extra large telescopes. So many collaboration with a key point about data. The second topics is health science.
Yeah.
Public health, health, gender. You mentioned before about women health, about so this kind of area like oncology, cancer, infectious disease. Sorry. And the last one is about social and human science, like history, like migrations, like minority studies, like history. Yeah, that's mainly the three main domains.
Okay. So I mean that kind of makes sense, right? Because these are the research areas that the Trump administration does seem to have been targeting so far. So it does sort of, it seems like it's sort of working in the sense that it's, if it was just lots of mathematicians or something, then you'd question whether this was actually picking up the kind of scientists you want to protect. But it does seem to be targeting the right kind of disciplines.
Yeah. And so, but that's why we need, because we have, as I mentioned before, we have strong collaboration in US, in institutions on these particularly topics. So we launched the Safe Place for Science program to try to continue our collaboration we had up to now with budget from NIH, from NSF, from NASA, from many. So now it seems that some of them are completely cut or part of them. So how are we able to continue to produce science with such colleagues? So mainly in US, yeah.
Yeah. And are these, the people who are applying, are these sort of junior scientists? Are these senior scientists? What's the sort of maturity of the people who have been applying? Because that's an interesting question too.
Yeah. When we launch the program, we thought that we should have junior scientist applications, but at the end, we have more than 60% are senior scientists. That means higher than 20 years of professional activities.
Yeah.
It's very
That's
senior.
you're also quite surprised by that, right? Because I suppose senior people have to move families, they're more established.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
might
yeah.
expect more junior people to move, but most people are pretty well established already in the US.
Yeah, but after analysis, it's not so surprising because who are people who are PI of big projects and funds and from NIH, from many US agency? It's mainly senior researcher. So it's after reflection, it's not so surprising that senior, because of their budget are completely cut. So they have to find some solution to continue their research on these specific topics. So we hope that we can help these colleagues to continue their work, which are very important for science and for everybody. So.
And there's also debate in Europe over if Europe does want and try to attract scientists from the US, is it going to be US citizens or is it going to be kind of Europeans who might think, okay, well, this is actually now the perfect time to return to Europe? You had, I think, when we spoke earlier, you had an interesting sort of nationality breakdown of the people who had applied.
Yeah. This was also surprising for us. We thought that be nationality or European citizens, because we know that US during the last century, so just after the Second War, the World War II area, US was a welcome land for researchers. So many European researchers work in US, many of them, for many topics. So we thought at the beginning that European people aims to go back to Europe, but from the 300 applications, close to 60% are purely US citizens.
Right. Okay.
And 20% are B nationality. That means US citizen and many European country.
That's interesting. This is not largely about Europeans wanting to return to Europe. This is actually US. Most people are sole US citizens wanting to France, which I think that will probably surprise people because presumably it'd be easier to attract Europeans back to Europe rather than get people to take a chance at rooting everything going to a different country.
But okay. But when we discuss with, because we are now at the, we did last week a pre-selections from the 300 applications. We pre-selected 40, close to 40 applications, and from last week up to today, we have discussions, more formal discussion with these pre-selected applicants, and we discuss about the situation they have up now in US. So many of them told us that they have no more budgets to continue their research. The situation in their institutions is not so easy depending on the topic they are working on, and they are not able to carry out any projects. So they really aim to find solutions to continue not only their research, but continue to collaborate with international colleagues, international researchers that we aim to propose.
Yeah. And just one final question, Denny, before we move on to Erica. There've been some people in this debate in Europe who have asked, well, hang on, okay, it's all very well offering special schemes to US scientists, but why target it specifically the US? You know, if you're a researcher sitting in, you know, Turkey or parts of Chinese universities, or you'll say, well, hang on, we've suffered from eroding academic freedom for a long time, and suddenly the Europeans are setting up these special schemes for Americans. You know, why target this specifically at the US? Why not make it for any scientist in the world who's having their a lack of academic freedom or heavy cuts to their particular area of research.
Yeah, maybe in this case, for Safe Place for Science is really dedicated to US, to people working in US up to now. But what I need to mention before is that from Aix-Marseille University, we were very involved from the last 5-10 years. We developed a attractivity program, and part of it is dedicated to scientific or artists in what we can call complex situations where they have some difficulties to realize their job. That means that up to now, it's mainly due to conflict area like Russo-Ukrainian conflict, like the Israelo-Palestinian in Africa. So from the last 5 years, we focus on these specific areas. We welcome up to now, I think, close to 20 researchers or artists from these conflict areas. So we aim to help people in quite difficulties. So now it's not the same situation in US, of course, it's not a conflict one, but why we choose to do better or more, considering the policy, scientific policy in the US, is when we analyze our international collaborations, more than 50% of co-publications are done with US institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So that means US is already, and I hope will continue to be, a place where science and excellent science are done. So we need to help. We need to help in this. Yeah, what we summarize here as complex period to continue research with US colleagues. Yeah.
Okay, so you have been offering sort of places for threatened scholars outside the US.
But
because of the strength of the links with the US, this is something you felt like you had to do. Okay, great.
Yeah, you mentioned large, just to conclude, about large infrastructure. We have clinical research, we have strong, large infrastructure. We mentioned CERN, we mentioned climate chamber, for example, many things. So we need really to try to continue collaboration with these colleagues. So this is the main.
Thank you, Denis. That's a really cool summary of what you've been up to at Aix-Marseille University. It sounds very interesting. Now, just finally, I'd like to bring in Erica Goldman. And Erica, as I said, setting up this bit of the webinar, I don't think we've really heard very much from US scientists about what they would like Europe to do. There's been a huge amount of chatter in Europe of, what should we do? Can we set up various schemes to attract people from the US. In Germany, where I'm based, I think there's been a bit of squeamishness, if I can characterize it like this, about attracting US scientists. But the fear it might seem a little bit opportunistic, or it might even undermine US science as it tries to sort of weather this storm. So what do you say to that? Should, is it sort of uncollegiate to try and poach US scientists at this time, or would you see it very differently?
Thanks, David. That's an interesting question. And I think maybe to answer it, I just want to share a little bit about the perspective that I bring to this. And so the program I represent at the Federation of American Scientists focuses on policy entrepreneurship. So coming from the belief that good experts with good ideas can work in dynamic ways to bring those ideas into spaces where decisions are made. And I think what I would observe is that I think what we're seeing in France and in Germany is actually a tremendous act of policy entrepreneurship in progress. We're seeing funding agencies pivot quickly, create programs from the ground up to set up structures to welcome and invite US scientists at a time of change, and sort of just acknowledging that level of kind of change at the institutional level is not easy, and it takes a fair amount of political will. And so I think I would say that what I see, I think there are different ways of looking at it, but I see it as an act of generosity rather than opportunism.
Right.
And there's an opportunity in this moment, and that we're seeing this as a recognition of the risk that American scientists are facing, the generational changes that could be a consequence of, limiting pipelines of emerging students who are hoping to apply to PhD programs, thinking about futures of whole careers in science that might be lost, that will find an opportunity to continue outside of the US during this time. And so I think I don't perceive it personally as poaching, but an opportunity to kind of create to really acknowledge that science is a global enterprise, and that the strength of science as a global enterprise is going to depend on that strength transcending national borders in a way that may be quite different than what we've seen before.
Okay, great. So your message is sort of don't feel guilty about this, right? Okay, that's really, really interesting to hear, because I suppose, yeah, if you think of science as a global system, right, this is we shouldn't always view it as a sort of nationalistic competition between the US, China, Europe, and so on. And I suppose it's possible those US scientists who moved to Europe could, of course, move back in the future, right? This is also entirely possible. Yeah, yeah. Is there anything else that European universities and research organizations can do at this point to help US colleagues who feel that their independence is threatened and their funding in particular areas is being taken away? I mean, what else can Europe do, really?
Thanks, David. And I think to just your point that you ended on, I do think there is a chance that this time is temporary, and that US scientists may move back into the US. But I would offer that I think if we see movement back into the US, the strength of international collaborations that are built during this time will likely move back with them. And so
Right.
to this question of, we're struggling in this moment, as Cole highlighted so well, with challenges that we may be facing about opportunities to subgrant to universities outside of the US. I think that this idea that reciprocity might not be immediately possible, but that when climate changes again, that we're likely to see the strength of global participation, kind of a wave of that sustained beyond the period that we're in. So that is my hope, and that's from an optimistic perspective somewhat. And then I think to your second question, what else can US universities or foreign universities do, universities outside the US? I think, and we were reflecting on this when I chatted with you earlier, I think there's, beyond the science enterprise, we're seeing enormous negativity around all of higher education right now. I think this just scrutiny that US universities are under, and kind of what does higher education even mean in this moment? And I think this recognition that globally, what has higher education meant to universities across the world? The university tradition in the US is one that is born from European origins. It goes back, hundreds and hundreds of years, and the ability to continue to communicate that this culture around higher education, the opportunities that it can offer, the ideas around academic freedom, pursuit of knowledge, pursuit of learning. I think that kind of those voices and that modeling that can come from outside of the US right now, I think would help buoy up and give inspiration to folks that aren't feeling it quite so much in the US right now.
Okay, so Europe, which is largely the sort of historical home of universities to speak up more for their independence, their value, and so on, would help people across the Atlantic as well. Okay, that's really interesting. You briefly mentioned, yeah, the thing we discussed with Cole, which is the sort of end of these NIH sub-awards. Yeah, you point to an interesting thing here, which is to compensate for that, perhaps European funding agencies might want to be more generous with their sub-award procedures to allow Americans to join European-led projects, of course, and European-funded projects. But of course, there's the sort of real politic of reciprocity here. You can also imagine European funders might not want to do that if they say, well, hang on, the NIH is shutting our universities out of its sub-awards. So, but yeah. Your point here is what, that don't look for immediate reciprocity in this year, but maybe this will be reciprocated sort of 10 years down the line or something like this.
Yeah, so I think there's an aspect of there is a long view here on kind of the building of what the global science enterprise might look like. And I would say in that even within the US, it's also, I think, a time of opportunity to really look at how have we been funding science, what works, what doesn't work, how might we think about the infrastructure that supports science and creates innovation and opportunity to fund in different ways. I think those conversations are breaking wide open in the US as well. And so, thinking about like, with what comes next in a rebuilt version of the NIH, would we fund research in the same way? Would we use kind of meta-scientific approaches to try to identify innovation? What projects are likely to lead to break more cutting edge discoveries rather than incremental findings? And those are conversations that are active in the US. And so I think, maybe it's an opportunity to kind of look internationally about what are the funding practices that aren't just based on like what was, but what could be in the future that both benefit international collaboration, support innovation, and really, drive things forward. I think we're in a period where so much has been disrupted that the opportunity for imagination and innovation is really strong as well.
Yeah, you made this point to me before, which is, although there is a huge amount of hostility towards universities and scientists within the Trump administration, there are one or two voices who are rather more constructive. The new director of the OSTP, Michael Kretios, I think, gave a speech last month where he's critical in some respects, but he does seem to be tuned into this broader, some of the things you're talking about, sort of research reform, new ways of finding innovation, new ways of funding research. So your message seems to be, we're not giving up despite the massive hostility from large parts of the administration on lobbying for new science ideas and research reform and so on. There's just one final point that I'd like to discuss as well. I mentioned with Cole, this fear of having your visa revoked, of being deported, of being stopped at the border is making maybe make foreign scientists a little bit more worried to go to the US for conferences or for research collaborations. How does the rest of the scientific world respond to that?
I mean, I think that's a difficult one. I hope deeply that it's one that is resolved and that we move past this period of fear that I think is real right now. And I think what I would offer is that we innovated a lot during COVID during the pandemic on how we communicate, collaborate, retain connection and community. And I think that leaning into, in this interim period, like leaning into some of what we learned about how to do that and really build community if it really does become more challenging for foreign scientists to come to meetings in the US, what can we learn and how can we continue some of those practices that we all developed globally to kind of stay more closely connected.
Okay, so potentially more sort of online options during conferences once again. I mean, I'm sure we're slightly sick of Zoom
about that, but I think.
Okay.
But we've learned. I think we've learned a lot. I mean, if we go back to pre-2020 days about what it would be like to participate in a hybrid event, we've come a long way from that. So.
Okay. That's interesting advice too. So yeah, maybe think a little bit more about this. If a US physical attendance at US conferences is challenging, a little bit angsty right now. Okay. We're approaching 4 o'clock, so I will wrap it up there. As you can see from this session, we could have spoken for another 2 hours. There have been so many changes, so many things to deal with, and so many questions for how Europe should respond to this. But I hope we've managed to make the situation a little bit more clear and ask some interesting questions about how Europe should respond to this pretty extraordinary avalanche of changes in the US. I will say thank you to all three of you for attending. Thank you to you online for tuning in. I hope you go away rather more enlightened. We at Science Business will be continuing to report on these issues because they're enormously important to our readers and transatlantic cooperation over the next 4 years. I will say goodbye and yeah, tune into our website for more events coming up for Science Business later this year. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.